Have you ever felt that deep, almost aching urge to explain yourself when someone misunderstood you? The impulse rises in your chest like a wave, fast, uninvited, impossible to ignore. You want to set the record straight. You want to make them see who you really are. You want to protect your name, your intentions, your heart, or perhaps you felt the sting of betrayal from someone you trusted without hesitation. A friend, a partner, a colleague, someone you let into the quiet spaces of your life. And when the truth of their actions came to light, it felt as if the ground itself had shifted beneath you. In those moments, it's so tempting to fight back, to confront, to demand answers that may never satisfy you. We live in a world that often celebrates the loudest voices, the ones that shout over others to prove a point. We're told that if we don't speak up, we'll be defeated, dismissed, forgotten. But here is a quiet truth. Sometimes silence is not weakness. It is not surrender. It is not invisibility. Silence can be a powerful declaration, a decision to protect your energy rather than waste it convincing those who have already decided not to understand you. Today, I invite you to walk with me through 7 moments when saying nothing is not a sign of giving up, but a sign of knowing exactly who you are. Times when silence becomes your shield, your clarity, your quiet strength. Because in a world that measures power in decibels, perhaps the most courageous thing you can do is simply to stay silent. 1. When lies are told about you, there is a quiet kind of ache that comes when you discover someone has twisted your name into something unrecognizable. It feels at first like a small betrayal, a fraying of the threads that connect you to others. You might notice it in the way people look at you just a little too long, or in the sudden hush when you enter a room you used to feel welcome in. And your heart, so eager to be understood, starts to beat with the familiar plea. Please, let me explain. But in the teachings of the Buddha, there is a story that whispers a gentler way. It is said that one afternoon, a man came to the Buddha, voice quivering with anger, and accused him of all manner of things: deceit, arrogance, false teaching. The man's words spilled out like a torrent, hoping to drown the Buddha in shame. Yet the Buddha sat unmoved, his gaze soft as a lotus in still water. When the man paused, expecting an argument or a denial, the Buddha spoke in a voice that was calm but steady, like the hush after a storm. If someone offers you a gift, and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong? The man blinked, uncertain. To the one who offered it, he replied. The Buddha inclined his head, his smile as gentle as dawn. So it is with your anger. I do not accept it. It remains with you. There is such deep wisdom in that story. When lies are told about you, they are like gifts you never asked for. You are under no obligation to receive them, to cradle them in your palms, to let them seep into your spirit. You do not have to hold the burden of someone else's malice or misunderstanding. But oh, I know how strong the desire is to prove you are innocent. How the mind replays the accusations again and again, searching for the perfect words that will clear your name. Yet the more you explain, the more you entangle yourself in the very net someone else has cast. Lies, by their nature, feed on reaction. They thrive on your protests, on your insistence that you be seen clearly. It is a paradox. The louder you speak, the more your voice sounds like desperation. And desperation is never a convincing witness. There was an old woman I once knew, a neighbor named Mabel, whose life became entangled in just such a storm. One day, a rumor bloomed like a weed in her small community that she had stolen money from the charity she volunteered for. She was devastated, bewildered by how quickly people she trusted turned suspicious. At first, she did what many of us would do. She defended herself to anyone who would listen. She explained. She recounted every detail, every receipt, but the more she explained, the more the rumor seemed to grow, as if her words were rain on thirsty soil. One evening, after weeks of anguish, she came to me with eyes hollowed by worry. "I've done everything I can to make them believe me," she whispered, "and still they doubt." I remember sitting with her in the fading light and saying gently, "Then perhaps it is time to stop explaining. Perhaps it is time to let the truth be its own advocate." Mabel went quiet after that. She chose not to offer any more words in her defense. She returned to her work, tending her garden, visiting the elders she cared for. She let her life speak. And in time, months, not days, people began to see that the rumor was a shadow with no substance. Her kindness, her steadiness, revealed the truth more eloquently than any argument ever could. So if you too find yourself the subject of lies, I invite you to consider this. What would happen if you simply did not pick up the story someone else has thrown at your feet? What if you trusted that truth, though slow, is also inevitable? The Buddha taught, 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. You don't need to force the truth to surface. You only need to refuse to sink. And when you choose this quiet path, you discover that your silence is not an absence. It is a clear, bright presence. It is a vow to let your integrity, not your defense, define you. As you sit with that, ask yourself softly, what if the greatest testament to my character is not how well I argue, but how peacefully I wait? 2. When someone betrays you, there is something singularly painful about betrayal, especially when it arrives from hands you once trusted without hesitation. It does not come with the sudden violence of an open wound. No, it moves more like a slow, cold seeping into your bones, numbing everything you thought was safe. One day you wake up and realize the person you confided in, the one who knew your quiet hopes and your private fears, has used that closeness as a weapon. The heart stirs with 1,000 questions. How could you? Did I mean so little to you? Was it all a lie? Yet in the quiet corridors of Buddhist teaching, there is a story that offers a lantern for such darkness. Long ago, a disciple came to the Buddha, his face drawn with sorrow. He had discovered that his closest friend had betrayed him, selling his secrets for coin and favor. He confessed, "Master, my mind is consumed with anger. I want to confront him, to demand an explanation." The Buddha listened patiently, then told him of a man who, upon being shot with an arrow, became obsessed not with removing it, but with discovering who had fired it, why, and from where. The man's agony only deepened as he demanded answers to questions that could not heal him. The Buddha said simply, while he searched for reasons, the poison took his life. What a gentle but piercing reminder. Sometimes the insistence on understanding why only prolongs our suffering. The person who betrayed you has already crafted a story in which they were justified. They may never see the wreckage they caused, or worse, they may see it and remain unmoved. And the more you demand explanation, the more you keep the wound from closing. It is like picking at a scab that longs to knit itself whole. I once met a woman named Eleanor who knew this pain intimately. She had been married for 30 years to a man she thought she knew to the marrow of her bones. When she discovered he had been unfaithful, she said it felt as though her very reflection had cracked. For months, she chased answers, questions that circled back on themselves, always ending in the same hollow place. She wanted him to confess, to crumble, to admit that she deserved better. But each conversation became a performance, a rehearsal of excuses. Late one evening, Eleanor sat in her kitchen, the house silent except for the ticking clock. In that stillness, something settled inside her, not peace, not yet, but a weary clarity. She realized she was waiting for him to validate her worth by admitting he had been wrong. And perhaps, she thought, that was a task he would never have the courage to fulfill. So she made a choice that felt, at first, like giving up. She stopped asking why. She stopped calling. She gathered her things and left a note with only these words: "I release you and I release myself." In the months that followed, her grief did not vanish, but it began to transform. No longer fueled by a need for justification, it softened into acceptance. Betrayal, as Seneca once wrote, is friction that polishes the soul. It is the friction that teaches us where our true boundaries lie, what we must no longer excuse, and how to love ourselves enough to walk away without a single shouted word. If you find yourself in this place, trembling on the edge of the need to confront, pause, take a slow breath. Ask yourself, will their explanation heal me, or will it only reopen the wound? You may find, as Eleanor did, that silence is not a sign you are weak. It is a sign that you have finally chosen to protect your spirit over your longing. The Buddha said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." When someone betrays you, your silence is not a punishment for them. It is a sanctuary for you. It is the quiet acknowledgement that you are no longer willing to plead for understanding from a person who chose to disregard your heart. And as you sit in that hush, you may begin to feel something unexpected, a flicker of relief, a softening, an awareness that your worth was never measured by their loyalty. It has always been yours to claim. So ask yourself, gently, what if the absence I offer now is the greatest gift of respect I could ever give myself? 3. When you are insulted, there is a peculiar sting that comes when someone hurls an insult your way. It doesn't always arrive with raised voices or pointed fingers. Sometimes it slips in sideways, a careless comment, a sarcastic laugh, a glance that says more than any words could. And in that instant, you feel the heat rising in your chest, the familiar swell of indignation. Part of you wants to craft the perfect reply, something sharp enough to put them in their place. You imagine the satisfaction of seeing their smug expression falter, of finally proving you will not be belittled. But in the quiet corners of Buddhist wisdom, there is another path, one that does not ask you to outwit your critic, nor to match their hostility word for word. There is a story often told of the Buddha himself, who was approached by a man consumed with anger. This man unleashed a torrent of insults, each one more vicious than the last, hoping to provoke, to wound, to draw the Buddha into a battle of egos. Yet the Buddha simply listened, his face untroubled as the surface of a calm pond. When the man finally exhausted his rage, the Buddha looked at him gently and said, "If you offer me a gift and I decline to accept it, to whom does it belong?" The man, puzzled, stammered, "To me, of course." The Buddha inclined his head, voice quiet but clear. "Then so it is with your anger. I do not accept it. It remains yours." How disarming it is when we realize we are under no obligation to carry the weight of another's unkindness. You see, insults are rarely about truth. They are, more often, confessions revealing the other person's own pain, their own dissatisfaction, their need to feel powerful, if only for a moment. And when you react, when you snap back or defend yourself, you validate the very thing they crave, proof that their words can move you. I think of a man I once knew, a retired carpenter named Frank, who attended a local meditation circle. Frank was not the sort of person you would expect to be drawn to stillness. He was broad-shouldered, quick with a joke, someone who had worked with his hands all his life. But after retiring, he found himself unexpectedly vulnerable to the barbed remarks of a neighbor who seemed determined to belittle his accomplishments. Week after week, this man would make little jabs. Must be nice to have nothing to do, or guess you weren't ambitious enough to keep working. At first, Frank tried to answer back, to prove that he had worked hard, that he had earned his rest. But every response only led to more taunts, more laughter. One evening, during a discussion on the Dhammapada, our teacher shared a verse: "Hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love. This is an eternal law." The teacher then looked around the circle and asked, "And if you cannot yet respond with love, can you respond with nothing?" Frank went quiet, the question settling in his mind like a pebble dropped into water. The next time his neighbor sneered, he didn't argue, he didn't explain. He simply smiled, nodded, and let the insult drift past him like smoke. For the first time, he felt an unexpected lightness, because he was no longer tethered to the need to win. As the weeks passed, something remarkable happened. The neighbor's remarks became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Without Frank's reactions to feed on, the man's cruelty simply withered. Frank told me later, "It was the strangest thing. The more silent I became, the more free I felt, like I had finally stopped carrying a burden that was never mine." If you find yourself the target of someone's disdain, I invite you to consider, what if you didn't have to take the bait? What if your stillness could become a refuge that no insult could enter? Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." In that spirit, when the urge rises to lash back, pause, breathe. Remember that their words are a mirror, reflecting their inner turmoil, not your worth. And when you choose silence, you are not conceding defeat. You are choosing the path of self-respect, the quiet confidence that does not need validation from those who seek to diminish you. As you sit with this thought, perhaps ask yourself gently, what would happen if, just this once, you let their insult remain exactly where it was born, outside of you? 4. When someone plays the victim to manipulate, there are moments when a person does not attack you directly, but instead spins a delicate web of half-truths and sighs, of downcast eyes and trembling voices, until suddenly you find yourself cast as the villain in a story you never agreed to join. This kind of manipulation is more insidious than open conflict, because it wears the mask of innocence. It tugs at your empathy. It invites you to step into the role of comforter, even as you feel the unease rising in your chest, the sense that something here is not quite honest. In the gentle light of Buddhist stories, we find a parable that touches this very predicament. Long ago, in a small village, there lived a monk who was well respected for his calm and clarity. A woman in the village, driven by her own hidden grievances, began telling others that the monk had taken advantage of her trust. She would appear in the marketplace with tears shining in her eyes, her voice low and quivering as she recounted her tale. People gathered around her, offering sympathy, whispering their shock. One day, the woman's story reached the ears of the monk himself. When a fellow villager, concerned and indignant, came to warn him of the growing rumor, the monk simply folded his hands, bowed his head, and said, "Thank you for bringing this to me." He did not seek the woman out to confront her. He did not rush to proclaim his innocence. He did not gather witnesses or compose a defense. Instead, he continued his daily practice, sweeping the temple steps, tending to the sick, offering blessings to any who asked. Weeks passed. The woman noticed that the monk did not respond. He did not argue. He did not even seem disturbed. This quiet unnerved her more than any outburst could have. One evening, overcome by the hollowness of her own performance, she returned to the temple, fell to her knees and wept. "I have lied," she confessed. "I thought, if I played the victim, I could harm you. but you gave me nothing to fight." In this story, the monk understood something profound, that when someone is committed to their own narrative, no explanation will dislodge them from it. To engage, to defend, to protest. These are the very things that keep the performance alive. It is only in the space of your silence that the story loses its audience. I once knew a woman named Marjorie, who worked many years as a nurse in a small town clinic. There was a colleague, let's call her Evelyn, who had a habit of turning every conflict into an opportunity to be pitied. If Marjorie asked her to complete a task, Evelyn would later tell others, in a tearful voice, that she was being bullied. If a simple disagreement arose, Evelyn would recount it as a personal attack. Marjorie, who was conscientious and kind, at first tried to clarify, to bring receipts and reason, to prove she was not the villain. But each time she did, Evelyn's narrative grew more elaborate, her tears more convincing. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting meeting, Marjorie confided to her meditation group, "I feel like I am constantly defending myself against a story that isn't real." The teacher, an elderly man with a soft voice, nodded thoughtfully. "And what would happen," he asked, "if you stopped defending? If you simply let her performance play itself out?" The question struck Marjorie like a bell ringing in the quiet of her heart. She realized she had been feeding the illusion by trying to dismantle it. The next time Evelyn began her lament, Marjorie said nothing. No argument, no explanation, only a calm, untroubled stillness. Over time, others began to notice the pattern, how Evelyn always seemed to be the victim, no matter the situation, and how Marjorie never mirrored the hostility. Eventually, the stories lost their power because they were met with no resistance. The Buddha once taught, "Just as a solid rock is not shaken by the storm, even so the wise are not affected by praise or blame." This is the invitation to become the rock, to allow the winds of false accusation to blow past you without stirring your center. If you are facing someone who weaves a tale of suffering to manipulate your compassion, pause and ask yourself, am I trying to convince them, or am I trying to convince myself that I am good? You are already whole. You are already worthy. You do not need their acknowledgement to prove it. And so the next time you are tempted to step onto their stage, remember Marjorie's quiet triumph. Consider this question as you breathe into your own calm. What if the most powerful way to respond to a false story is simply to refuse to become a character in it? 5. When your presence is taken for granted, there is a certain kind of loneliness that does not come from being alone, but from being constantly present for people who have forgotten how to see you. You may know this feeling if you have ever been the one who always called first, who remembered the birthdays, who reached out simply to say, "I'm thinking of you." And in the beginning, your kindness felt like a gift shared freely. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, it turned into something expected, and then into something ignored. It's a quiet erosion, the way a shoreline disappears grain by grain, until one day you realize you have become background noise in someone's life, always there, always reliable, never cherished. And your heart, that once opened so generously, begins to wonder, have I made it too easy to forget my worth? In the gentle wisdom of the Buddha's teachings, there is a parable that speaks to this silent ache. It tells of a woman named Kisa Gautami, who lost her only child to sudden illness. Overcome with grief, she carried his small body from house to house, pleading for medicine that could bring him back. Many people turned her away, uncomfortable with her sorrow. But some invited her in, offering empty comfort and then sending her along, relieved when she departed. Finally, Kisa Gautami came to the Buddha himself. She fell at his feet, her voice ragged with desperation, and cried, "Master, please help me bring my son back." The Buddha looked at her with eyes full of compassion. "Go," he said softly, "and bring me a mustard seed from a home that has never known loss." And so she walked the village again, knocking on doors. But at every house, she heard stories of other sorrows, other mothers, fathers, husbands, friends who had slipped beyond reach. She returned to the Buddha empty-handed, but something in her had changed. In seeing how universal her pain was, she recognized that her grief did not make her invisible, nor did it make her unworthy of care. It simply made her human. This story, while born of a deeper loss than neglect, holds a truth that gently echoes in our smaller disappointments. The realization that being constantly available cannot protect you from being unseen, and that sometimes stepping back is the only way to remind others and yourself of your inherent value. I remember an old neighbor named Howard, who had retired years before I met him. He was a man of quiet rituals, tending his garden in the early hours, walking to the post office every afternoon, visiting the same friends each Sunday without fail. He was the one everyone called when they needed help. A ride to the clinic, a hand with a broken fence, a patient ear, and he never said no. But over time, Howard noticed that if he stopped calling, the phone stayed silent. If he stopped offering, no one asked how he was. I still remember the day he told me, with a sad little shrug, "I think I've made it too easy for them to take me for granted." One morning, Howard decided to try something different. He simply stopped initiating. No announcements, no drama, just a quiet stepping back. The days turned into weeks. Some people never called, some drifted away, but a few, just a precious few, knocked on his door, their faces full of concern. "I haven't heard from you. Are you all right?" And in that moment, Howard understood that his absence had revealed what his presence could not, who truly valued the quiet constancy of his friendship, and who only valued the convenience. The Buddha taught, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." What a gentle, radical truth this is. It means you are not required to prove your worth by always being the first to reach out. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to let others meet you halfway. If you feel that your presence has become invisible, I invite you to ask yourself, what if stepping back is not an act of anger, but an act of love? Love for yourself, and a chance for others to remember your true place in their hearts. And as you sit in the hush of that question, consider this. Sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do for a relationship is to let your absence speak what your words cannot. Not to punish, not to shame, but simply to say, with quiet dignity, "I am here, but I will no longer stand where I am not seen." 6. When someone tries to provoke you, there is a certain kind of person who seems to thrive on conflict the way a fire thrives on dry wood. You will recognize them by the way they tilt their head and smile faintly when they deliver a cutting remark, as if they are studying you for a reaction. They slip small barbs into casual conversations, just enough to sting, but not enough to be called out easily. And every time they watch to see if you will flinch, defend yourself, or rise to meet them in the quarrel they are so eager to ignite. If you have ever found yourself in this dance, you know how exhausting it can be, how your mind replays their words long after you have walked away, how your body tightens in anticipation the next time you see them. It is a kind of quiet warfare, one that seeks to steal your peace without ever declaring open battle. There is a story told in Buddhist circles of a young monk who struggled with exactly this kind of provocation. In the monastery where he lived, there was another monk who would test his patience at every turn. If the young monk was cleaning the courtyard, the other would scatter leaves where he had just swept. If he was meditating, the other would cough and sigh theatrically. If he offered a teaching, the other would interrupt with sly questions designed to embarrass him. One day, after many months of this, the young monk went to the master and confessed, "I cannot bear it any longer. He wants to humiliate me, and I feel my heart burning every time I see his face." The master listened quietly and then said, "Go and fetch a small candle." When the young monk returned, the master lit the candle and placed it between them. "This flame," he said softly, "is your anger, your need to respond. When he blows on it, it flares brighter. When he insults you, it grows taller. But if you stop feeding it your breath, if you stop giving him your fuel, it will flicker and die." The young monk looked at the small flickering light, and for the first time understood that it was not the other man's actions that caused his suffering, but his own need to respond. I think of this story often because it so perfectly illustrates what happens when we allow ourselves to be pulled into someone else's storm. Their words are the wind, but our reactions are the tinder. When we respond with anger or justification, we keep the flame alive. When we choose stillness, the fire starves. There was a man I once knew named Paul, who worked for many years in a small office. One of his colleagues, a man named Dennis, seemed to find endless delight in provoking him. In meetings, Dennis would make small, barbed comments, always with that same practiced innocence. "No offense, Paul, but I think you're overcomplicating things," or "interesting idea. Maybe next time we'll go with something that actually works." At first, Paul tried to respond calmly, to explain his reasoning, to show he was unbothered. But the truth was, he was anything but unbothered. Each night he would lie awake, replaying the conversations, thinking of all the clever retorts he wished he'd delivered. One evening, after a particularly humiliating meeting, Paul sat in the quiet of his kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. He remembered a phrase he had once read in a book of Buddhist teachings: "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And so, the next day, he decided to try something different. When Dennis delivered his usual jab, Paul looked at him with a gentle, unhurried gaze. He said nothing. He did not nod or smile or frown. He simply allowed the silence to expand between them, like a wide, clear sky. For the first time, Dennis faltered. The room, which had grown accustomed to their back and forth, stayed quiet. And in that quiet, Paul discovered something he had not expected: a profound relief. Because he had finally understood that he did not have to attend every argument to which he was invited. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." But sometimes, the most peaceful word is no word at all. If you find yourself the target of someone's constant need to provoke, I invite you to pause and consider, what if their need for your reaction is not your responsibility? What if the strongest thing you can do is simply to remain unmoved? As you reflect on this, perhaps ask yourself gently, what would happen if you allowed their words to drift past you, like leaves carried on a breeze you no longer felt the need to chase? 7. When they regret losing you, there comes a moment, sometimes weeks later, sometimes years, when someone who once took you for granted finally notices the space you left behind. It doesn't always happen with fanfare or tearful confessions. More often, it arrives quietly. An unexpected message, a hesitant call, a pause when your name comes up in conversation. And in that pause, you can hear the soft echo of regret. Perhaps you know this moment. You gave your time, your love, your care, without keeping score. You were the one who showed up, again and again, believing that your presence was enough to remind them of your worth. But over time, the familiarity of your kindness turned into expectation. They stopped saying thank you. They stopped wondering how you felt. They assumed you would always be there, waiting in the same place, holding the same door open. And then one day, you closed that door, not in anger, but in quiet resolve. You stepped away, not to punish them, but to honor yourself. And in your absence, they discovered something they never noticed when you were near, that your presence was not an obligation, but a gift. In the old Buddhist texts, there is a story of a woman named Malika, who was the beloved queen of a great king. For many years he cherished her above all others, but as time passed, he grew complacent, assuming that her devotion would remain no matter how thoughtlessly he behaved. He became careless with his words, dismissive of her counsel, impatient with her needs. One evening, after yet another slight, Malika chose to leave the palace and return to the simple home where she had been born. She left no accusation, no final speech, only a garland of fresh flowers on her pillow, a quiet symbol of gratitude for the love they once shared. For days, the king scarcely noticed her absence. He told himself she would return, that her place beside him was inevitable. But as the weeks passed, he began to feel the emptiness where her presence had once been, a hush in the halls, a stillness in the chambers she had brightened with her laughter. He tried to summon her with gifts and promises, but she did not return. And in that emptiness, he discovered the true measure of what he had lost. When at last he visited her, he fell to his knees, voice hoarse with remorse. "I did not see you clearly when you stood beside me," he whispered. "I only saw you when you were gone." Malika looked at him with eyes full of compassion, but also of certainty. "I do not hate you," she said softly, "but I have learned to love myself more than I long for your recognition." How many of us have waited for this moment, have dreamed that when someone finally realizes our value, we will feel whole again. But here is the tender truth. When someone only begins to cherish you after you have withdrawn, their regret is not a sign that you must return. It is a sign that they have begun to see the truth you always knew, that you were never ordinary, never expendable. Epictetus once wrote, "No man is free who is not master of himself." To master yourself is to resist the temptation to walk back through doors you closed with good reason. It is to understand that their remorse does not erase the long days you spent waiting to be seen. I think of a woman named Ruth, who spent 40 years tending to a marriage that asked her to shrink smaller and smaller. Her husband was never cruel, only careless. He forgot her birthdays, dismissed her opinions, assumed her patience was endless. One day, after a quiet dinner where he barely looked up from his newspaper, Ruth folded her napkin and said, "I will not do this anymore." She left that night with only a single suitcase and a heart that trembled between sorrow and relief. Months later, he came to her door with tears in his eyes, promising he had changed, that he finally understood her worth. Ruth listened quietly, her hands resting on her knees, and when he was done, she spoke in a voice as soft as it was unyielding. "I am glad you see it now," she said, "but I will not return to the place where I had to disappear to be loved." If you have ever been tempted to walk back into a life that did not honor you, I invite you to pause and ask yourself, is this regret enough to build something new? Or is it simply the echo of what was lost? The Buddha taught, you cannot travel the path until you have become the path itself. And sometimes the path is not back to what was, but forward into the quiet freedom of your own self-respect. As you consider this, breathe gently into the knowledge that your silence is not cruelty, it is wisdom. It says,
I honor what we shared, but I will not shrink to fit your memory of me. And perhaps in the hush that follows, you will discover that the greatest peace comes not from being welcomed back, but from finally feeling whole enough not to return.
Silence is so often misunderstood. To some, it looks like surrender, as though you have nothing left to say or no fight left in you. But in truth, silence can be a sanctuary, a space where you gather all the scattered pieces of your dignity and hold them close, safe from the noise of a world too quick to judge and too slow to understand. In a life that urges you to defend every step and justify every feeling, choosing not to react is an act of quiet courage. It is a declaration that you will not let someone else's chaos set the rhythm of your heart. You don't have to prove your worth to people who have already decided not to see you clearly. You don't have to plead for understanding from those who have made misunderstanding you into a pastime. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to step back and allow the space between you and others to speak the truth that words never could. Because the longer you stay silent, the more you realize that your value was never something you needed to announce. It has always been there, unshaken by other people's opinions, unchanged by their approval. So when the world tries to pull you into its endless arguments and tangled expectations, remember this: you are free to step away. You are free to let karma, time, and truth finish the sentences you chose not to speak. And you are free to stand in your own quiet certainty that you are enough, without performance, without explanation, without apology. Sometimes the most powerful declaration of strength is not the words you say, but the ones you choose to leave unsaid. And in that sacred hush, you find a peace no noise can ever touch.